Will doctors' strikes make waiting lists longer? Could rent caps help tenants? And can the high street survive? This is Politics Live. Joining me in the studio are the Conservative MP Siobhan Bailey, Labour peer Baroness Kennedy, the founder of Conservative Home Tim Montgomery, and the SNP MP Richard Thompson. Today, doctors in England staged the biggest walkout so far in the ongoing dispute over pay, but could the government force them back to work?
We are hemorrhaging talent overseas. We are in a situation where the brightest and the best in schools aren't going to go into medicine.
It's about getting a balance between protecting people's right to strike, but also recognising that time-critical, urgent and emergency care needs to be delivered.
We'll hear from one woman who's facing a long wait for her hip replacement. Private sector rents are at record levels. One viewer tells us how hard it is for tenants.
I was thrust into a horribly overheated marketplace where I estimate about 20 people were looking for every property that was being offered.
And as more Wilkos stores close today, can the high street survive the loss of another major brand? Hello, and we start today with the closure of yet more Wilkos stores. Let's have a look at this front page of the Daily Mirror. Wilkos store closures, full list of 86 shops shutting this week. Is yours on the list? A lot of people seemingly very upset about the closure of these Wilkos stores. We now know about 12,500 jobs at risk. No clue if they can be saved. And at the same time, we know that 14% of stores on our high streets are empty. Tim, do you use your local high street?
I do. Actually, I live in Salisbury and we've just had a Primark open. And last week there were queues to get into it. Now, I don't know what the impact on other local shops are, whether it's going to bring more people into Salisbury to shop there or whether it's going to take shopping away. But there is still a hunger, I think, out there for real, traditional shopping, not just online. That experience that you get through feeling the clothes and looking at the beautiful displays, I think people still want it. And in a way, the absence of it during the pandemic, etc., maybe there's more of a hunger for it than there was. I certainly hope so, because seeing that lively high street last week in Salisbury was a joy, actually. And,
do they want it, Elena Kennedy? Because the numbers would suggest the amount of online shopping that is happening would suggest that actually, whilst people might like the idea of it, practically they're not using their high streets.
Well, there's no doubt that the whole business of being able to just get something easily on Amazon, if you're working your socks off, as so many people in our society are having to work long hours, they're feeling burned out. We're going to be talking about doctors in a minute. And I think that it's so easy to just order things that I don't think that's going to change. But what I think is such a sadness is that lots of the stores that you really want, you need, the butchers, the bakers, but also the stuff where older people want to be able to buy gifts for their grandchildren. They want to be able to get cards. All of that sort of stuff. You want the ease of being able to go to the local community stores and hardware stores. Where people need plugs, they need batteries, they need all those kind of things. And I just think that, and I do think there is. I think Tim's right. There is something pleasurable about, certainly for me, in relation to clothes. I never feel comfortable, about the business of ordering things online. They're almost invariably, to me, a disappointment. And if you're someone who's not a standard size, whose bottom is bigger than they perhaps should be, then it just doesn't work. So I actually like the business of trying things on and being there and making a choice.
Siobhan, practically though, people seem to have this kind of almost nostalgic affection for the idea of a high street, but in practical terms, Is it savable in the long term?
The high street's been changing for a number of years, and I think in some respects the pandemic has fast-forwarded some of those changes and the behaviour habits online, but also because more people are working at home, they've got more access to the high streets. And in Stroud, Stonehouse, Dursley and Nailsworth, my little towns, there's a lot of independent shops. We pride ourselves on that. So the experiences are right. But I mean, we've seen a steady decline of the big budget brands going as well. Peacock and M&Co, and that poses difficulties for people that want sort of cheaper goods on the high street. But there is no doubt about it that the high streets are changing. I think it requires some interesting kind of innovation of private investment in addition to the state funding. We know that the levelling up, every area in the country can apply in to get some cash, but I think it needs a really good business case to get taxpayers' cash.
The government toyed with the idea of the online sales tax, but that actually was scrapped. That's because actually online retailers have certain advantages, don't they, over people who are on the high street having to pay rent and other local taxes.
Bricks and mortar shops and small businesses will say to you business rates are something that needs reform, and they also look to the big ticket online people like Amazon who don't have those overheads.
The government be doing more on that?
Well, it's not a simple issue, and that because of the fast-paced changing of the online world, I think it is quite difficult to make the changes that will make the difference. But ultimately, we've got to just follow the trend of human behaviour, and I think that our high streets are managing to do that to some degree.
I think there are things, though, that can be done. I mean, I do think that we should be encouraging young people who've got business ideas to be going there. And you can only do that by not having rating levels that are so huge. But the problem is that local councils have had their grants from central government reduced incredibly. And so, therefore, the need to tax in other ways leads to rents being too high, rates being too high, all of that. And I think that there is a problem here that has to be addressed in a much more systemic way.
Richard.
Absolutely. I mean, like Siobhan, across my constituency, there's a number of small towns that have got fantastic local high streets, Ellen and Inverurie, and I think there's very much a case that people have to either use it or lose it. It's very, very convenient to click online and get something delivered to you. Also, I think that pre-pandemic, shops a number of shops suffered from almost being like showrooms where you went to look, to try, and then you went and bought it online to save a couple of quid. And I think that's something that really impels it. I mean, a classic example in Aberdeen, it breaks my heart still to walk past it, is Bruce Miller's. It was a shop that sold musical instruments, sheet music, great big televisions, nice coffee. I loved it. But
says the violinist.
Says the violinist. but it was done for by the ability to buy things just a bit cheaper online. So I think we have to use it or lose it. But Helena's right, Baroness Kennedy's right. It is about incentives and business rates. Sometimes in Scotland there's a small business bonus scheme which exempts many of the small traders from having to pay the full whack of business rates. But also sometimes I think landlords who own these premises have to be realistic about what they are going to get in the current market. But I think also environmental improvements, and that's where the councils and the government can come in to tidy places up, to tidy town and city centres up, and actually make them places that people want to spend time in. Because if people want to spend time in those places, they'll also spend money.
Yeah. The evolution of the high street. OK, we're going to leave that there and move on now and talk about the doctors' strikes, because for the first time this week, the consultants have started today. Junior doctors in England go on strike tomorrow, and this is the first time in the history of NHS that we've had consultants and junior doctors on strike at the same time. Let's have a look at the headline on The Guardian this morning. They led with biggest walkout the NHS has ever seen, will put patients at risk, health body warns. The NHS Confederation says hospitals will cancel more appointments and operations than ever before. This, of course, on the back of the news last week that waiting times are now at their highest levels. 7.6 million people on waiting lists at the end of July. We can speak to one of those people now. Jane Ambrose is an NHS patient who's currently on the waiting list for a hip replacement. Jane, thank you very much for joining us on the programme today. Well, can you explain to us how long you have been waiting?
I have been waiting, it's well over a year now, from when I first I'd had a previous hip replacement, my right hip. So I decided to have a private consultation to make sure that the symptoms I were having were the same with my left hip. I had that private consultation last September and was told, yes, this is it. It's a year's waiting list. I subsequently had an NHS appointment. I paid privately for the consultation, but I can't afford 15,000 for a hip. My NHS appointment for the consultation was 27th of February this year. So I was expecting, as a bit of a year, I was going to have that done this September. When I asked for that to be confirmed, I was told, oh, well, it's a year from today, from the 27th of February. So in effect, it's now looking at not this month or next month, it's looking like next March, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, unless of course it is unfortunately postponed again. I mean, we hear
I think it will be.
Unfortunately, you know, we hear these figures, the number of people on waiting list, Jane. But for those that don't understand, I mean, what are your pain levels like? How does this affect your daily life whilst you're waiting?
It's extremely difficult. It is impacted further because I'm full-time carer for our autistic mentally ill son who has physical difficulties, and I have to move him about. You can imagine walking backwards is hard for somebody who hasn't got hip difficulties. I'm on very strong painkillers, which I am constantly having to speak to my GP about. I've been on this last one for about 2 or 3 months, I'd say. But I am thinking I need to up it again.
Yeah, so having to wait is having a practical impact because you are also a carer, as well as the pain that you're suffering, you're also a carer. Siobhan, if you stick with us, Jane, stay with me, I'll come back to you. Siobhan, you hear stories like Jane's. Is the fact that the government has failed to deal with the industrial action from doctors, you know, is that not an embarrassment to you as a Conservative MP? Well,
listen, I think every MP has got constituents who has had operations or procedures cancelled due to strikes. The strikes need to come to an end, but it's not right to say that the government hasn't done anything. I am absolutely clear that these strikes should end. I think we get into a situation where you can't talk about the NHS or the NHS workforce without sort of having to say we love them, but there needs to be a point where these strikes end. And the government actually backed the independent pay body. The government has made it absolutely clear the position on pay, and yet the BMA is still pushing these strikes forward. And I think the public are now looking and saying, well, hang on a minute, if teachers and nurses can come to an agreement on pay following the independent pay body's advice, then what is the situation with the doctors? And I think we've got to make those changes.
Okay, Baroness Kennedy.
Well, I mean, I have great sympathy with Jane, you know, this is one of those difficult things where people are suffering the consequences. However, we've got to be very clear and say to the public, who should we be directing our anger against in relation to this? Who is it we should be unhappy with? And we should be deeply unhappy with the way that the government has dealt with this. It's been 16 years since the doctors, and I don't call them junior doctors because some of them are people who are now nearly 40 and who have been studying for years. They've become members of Royal Colleges, and the real problem here has been a deliberate, I think, attrition against the National Health Service because of there are lots of vultures hovering around the private sector, American health companies and so on, wanting to swoop in. So I feel very strongly direct our anger at the right people. The government should have been doing something about this a long time ago. They deliberately have driven the National Health Service into the ground.
Jane, can I ask you to respond to that? Who are you angry at, if anyone? You know, are you angry at the doctors? Are you angry at the government?
I'm angry at the government. I feel this keeps being battered backwards and forwards. There needs to be a sit round the table. The doctors, the consultants, all the medical staff need to be paid what they're worth. There is money that the government spends on lots of other issues, and that could be directed here. It's as though the government's the disease and the actual strikes are the symptoms.
Tim,
This
the
is the
government is
way
the government is the disease. That's pretty powerful
Well,
from Jane.
the reality actually is that if you look at the total amount of spending now by the state, health and pensions are taking up an ever-increasing proportion as we get an older society.
So we
in
just
particular.
stop.
So, you actually, the services that are being squeezed are defence, local government, because actually the government is funding the NHS and pensions to an extraordinary extent. And what I think, where most people are at, and I think this is the danger for doctors now, is people are reasonable. And they know that we face a huge problem post-pandemic. The budgets of Western countries are all squeezed. Being offered nearly 10% is much more than most people, patients who are waiting for treatment, will get. There is a long-term problem for recruitment for certain NHS workforce members. We do need to recruit more doctors. We do need to address the fact that some doctors are going abroad. But now is not the time to be giving anything like a 33% pay settlement. And the fact is that actually English junior doctors have been offered something similar to what actually junior doctors in Scotland have settled for. But what you reveal from a lot of the leaders of the BMA when they say what's the difference is a political agenda. A lot of these junior doctors are wanting to cause damage to a Conservative government. The BMA has always been a very political organisation.
Let's stop calling them junior doctors. Let me just say that this is really something that we've got to agree with. Over the whole period of 13 years of Conservative government, we have seen a decrease in public spending in relation to many public services. And so when you say...
Not health,
No, you're saying the proportion, Tim, I'm listening to your words.
But real spending has gone up as well. Real spending has gone up.
Because a lot of technology costs a lot of money. The wages and the salaries of people who've spent years studying, who are committed to the health of their patients, they have not gone up. So let's be very clear. And don't make a comparison. These are professional people who we're going to lose them to other countries. And I'm really alarmed that there's such dismissiveness about this.
This is the big Labour lie, though, that Labour politicians come onto these programmes all the time, talk about Tory spending cuts, and then you say, where are you going to put up taxes? Where are you going to fund this more? Every time you talk about cuts, you have no plan to address this because, honestly, Britain is at the limit of the tax burden. We have to make hard choices, and unfortunately, Labour aren't willing to make the hard choices.
We spend less on health than most European countries.
Let's bring in Richard here because, Tim, you were just referring to Scotland and insinuating that it was a political decision for the BMA to call off their strikes in Scotland. But in fact, the Scottish Government made a more generous offer to the doctors.
No, it did indeed. And I think the difficulty, the argument that Tim's putting forward is that if you ask the general public to make a choice between believing politicians or siding with the doctors, they're instinctively going to side with doctors. But yeah, there was a more generous offer made in Scotland. There was a more collaborative approach. There was actual negotiations. There was not any attempt to try and demonise legitimate demands from doctors. And we've seen that also with the rail strikes. You know, the rail strikes were dealt with or threat of rail strikes were dealt with in Scotland because the government actually negotiated. Now, it seems to be that there's the UK government, the Conservatives, seem to see this as a wedge issue. They want to conjure up demons of the 1970s and trade unions. And it seems to me, and I think a great many other people, that this is being used as a kind of wedge issue to try and demonise dedicated public sector workers. And I think that the key to dealing with this, because there are many problems that need to be dealt with in the NHS right across the four nations of the UK post-pandemic, but the way to solve it is to get it working better and to make sure people are adequately rewarded for the effort that we expect of them.
What Tim touched on is the context that we're in. We have just come out of a pandemic. We spent £400–500 billion, whereby we actually shut a lot of the country down to protect the NHS and the NHS workforce. The whole country needs to come together and to pull ourselves out of that. The tough economic situation that we are in with inflation means that wage increases have a negative impact on us being able to bring that inflation down. And what the government doesn't have the luxury of, which the BMA does, which I think is being political now, and they're pushing it to the absolute limits because they think they can smell blood, had is that the government can't just focus on junior doctors or consultants. The government has to look across the whole of the public sector. So if the government was to give a 35% pay increase to junior doctors, what about the armed forces and the police and the teachers? Yet we've got agreements everywhere else. And I think to your point, Richard, when you're saying people do trust it, we love our doctors. You know, my mum's a nurse. We absolutely love our frontline NHS work staff. But what the issue is here, it's no longer the individual doctors, it's about the BMA and it's about the unions across the piece. And I think we've got to be very clear. This isn't a situation where government hasn't committed to increased pay increases for the doctors and the consultants. It's about average of 8.8% for the doctors and about 6% for the consultants. These are pay increases going up. Consultants will go up to sort of near 100 grand. You know, these are highly paid people with good futures. And the other thing I would say is the BMA's number one request was about the pensions. So what we made sure that there was a preferable.
So the government stepped in.
The government stepped in and did that. But then the BMA said, "Well, bank that, and we'll have something else."
In
and they've still carried on.
In the case of the junior doctors, they're not. The BMA are not here to represent themselves, but they would say this is about pay restitution because they have seen their pay squeezed over more than a decade.
But you have to deal with the context of the country finds itself right now. And actually the independent pay body has taken into account all of the historic pay increases and situation and inflation and everything else. So I think, you know, before Rishi, the Prime Minister, was announcing an agreement with the pay body, everyone was saying he wasn't going to do it and we were panicking about wanting to get to the pay body. They gave the pay body and then like, oh, that's not good enough, so keep moving.
Thinking about next steps, let's have a look at the front of the Times now. This is the action that the Health Secretary has announced he's taking today. Doctors on strike, government to unveil plans for minimum service levels. I mean, Siobhan, some people would say the timing of this is horrendous. If you want to come to some kind of agreement with the doctors, if you want to find a solution, threatening them with being unable to take industrial action is not the way of doing it.
Well, there's no stopping people striking. There will be an ability to strike even with the minimum service levels. We put this legislation, it's primary legislation. We went through all of this earlier in the year. We know that countries like Australia and Canada actually ban blue light services from going on strike. We're actually looking much more at providing a Sunday service. So if there's particular doctors who want to go on strike, they will be able to do so. But the reason that these announcements made is when we look across the country, about 17 areas, 17 trusts had agreements with local BMA representation and the trusts which involved the doctors, where they said, OK, we'll get to the point where we've organised the logistics so we can provide a service to local people to get their hip operations and get their dialysis and chemo, very important. But then the national BMA swooped in and said, no, you're not doing that. So actually, I do think there needs, and when you say about whether this is a threat, you know, we're thinking about the unions, we're thinking about the doctors again. Actually, the patients want to see government doing absolutely everything they possibly can to bring the strikes to the end. The Prime Minister's been so clear on pay, we've got to look at other issues.
Baroness Kennedy.
It's a sad thing because for 13 years the business of freezing the wages of consultants and of doctors who've studied for 7 years.
The Labour Party are saying they'll go further.
Well, hold on a minute. The whole business is that the National Health Service was created by a Labour Party that is very committed to it. I don't believe that the Conservative.
It's been under a Conservative government.
Yes, and let me just tell you what's happened is a shift in the nature of a Conservative government. That business of one nation conservatism, which believed in the National Health Service. This has been about an erosion of the National Health Service and to part privatise it. And that has definitely been a deliberate thing being done over 13 years.
Andy Burnham did more privatisation than the Conservatives did.
There is absolutely evidence of it.
Even the King's Fund have said that there's
the King's Fund is very clear about what's happened to the quality
every Labour government
of
campaign, every Labour Party campaign.
You're deprofessionalising the professions. That's what you've been doing.
Okay. But every Labour Party campaign I can remember at a general election says, if you vote Conservative, the Tories will privatise the National Health Service.
And it's been doing
every election it's been a lie. Every election it's been a lie.
OK, all right, people at home can't hear when we all talk over each other. But we are, in fact, going to leave that there. I just want to say thank you very much to Jane, who joined us this morning. And we wish you all the luck with your hip replacement, Jane. I hope that you get it as soon as possible. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Right, we are going to move on now and talk about rental properties. Let's take a look at this headline from the BBC yesterday. Rental prices rise at the fastest rate for 9 years, figures show. I want to hear first up from someone who's directly affected by this. This is a viewer of ours who we spoke to just before the programme, Peter Wilkos, who's a pensioner in Wiltshire.
I was thrust into a horribly overheated marketplace where I estimate about 20 people were looking for every property that was being offered. And you had to have something different to offer to put you to the head of the queue. So in my case, I had to give a year's rent up front. Obviously, that's several £1,000s in order to secure my place among the 20 people who were looking for a rental property. That was the only way in which I could secure anything. And that's how I am living where I am now.
OK, that was Peter Wilkos, who lives in Wiltshire and is a private tenant and is clearly struggling, found it very, very difficult to find a home. If I start with you, Richard, the government in Scotland did something pretty dramatic, didn't it? It introduced rent controls. Just talk us through that. How's it working?
Well, during the pandemic, there was an emergency legislation passed by the Scottish Parliament to protect the rights of tenants, to increase their rights over the tenure, to give them greater redress in the event of unlawful evictions by landlords. And there was also a cap placed on those existing tenancies of rent increases of 3%. And I think that's been of enormous help to people throughout that. Now, of course, when a tenancy changes, those restrictions don't apply. My understanding is that the emergency legislation could not lawfully apply to any future tenancies, which is why there is that. It's been described as a loophole. And I think you've got a very neat example there of what happens when you don't have rent controls, because rents have, under those tenancies that have turned over, have increased. Not far behind is some other parts of the UK. Edinburgh and Glasgow rents are up.
I mean, in fact, if I just show you the front, there's a Telegraph headline here, which sort of lays this out, really. Rents rising faster in Scotland than in London as Sturgeon's war on landlords backfires.
I think, to be fair, I would expect no less from the Daily Tory graph than to put that sort of spin on it. But
untrue.
But rents are rising very fast in Scotland, aren't they?
But they're also rising at a rate which isn't significantly above some other parts of England. So I think what that shows is that you have an example of what happens where rent controls apply and where they don't apply. And actually, it would be a good thing if we had extended rent controls right across the sector, because that way then we'd be able to protect people through this cost of living crisis. But let's not forget that there's multiple reasons why we're in this cost of housing crisis as part of the cost of living crisis. There aren't enough affordable homes now. The Scottish Government has built 120,000 since 2007, 86,000 of those for social rent. There's been another 110,000 built by 2032. So that's going some way to meeting the demand that is there. But fundamentally, with interest rates going up because of the disastrous mismanagement of the economy by the present UK government, we need to take radical steps to tackle housing, which is one of the most significant costs that anybody is ever going to incur.
And you mentioned that loophole of the thing between tenancies, which is apparently that is what is pushing up the rents in parts of Scotland. Is that something that Humza Yousaf is planning to close, that loophole?
Well, I would hope he does. But, there are no rent controls elsewhere in the UK, and rents are also increasing at a very, very high rate. So I think what it shows isn't that there's there's a gap that I think can be addressed there, but where those rent controls aren't in place elsewhere in the UK, you're seeing a very similar effect. So actually, rent controls, I think this shows work, and I would like to see it extended right across the rental market to protect people.
Shaking your head there, Tim.
Well, the thing is, look, there's a massive problem in the housing market. We need to build more houses. I'm a Conservative, but I think probably one of the Conservatives' biggest failures in office is not to build houses. We're talking about, just been talking about the pressures on the National Health Service. If we spent much less money on subsidising private landlords through housing benefits of various kinds, we would have more money for the National Health Service. One of the areas where we really could reduce the size of government. But rent controls don't work. They are a false solution, because ultimately, if private landlords can't make the kind of money that they need to make that letting work for them, they won't bring their properties onto the market, or they will, use them for a different purpose.
Okay.
So the rent controls don't work, and despite what Richard said, actually rents are going up faster in Scotland than in other parts of the UK.
What purpose are they going to put those empty properties to? Are they going to just sit and pay a mortgage on them and not collect any rent at all, just because they can't put the rents up by as much as they
Houses
would
can be
like?
converted to other purposes as well.
What does Labour think of this idea of rent control?
I mean, I think housing is going to be one of the big issues in the election next year, and one of the things that has driven up the cost of rents has been that so many people were encouraged and given the opportunities to buy to rent, and huge numbers of people did that, and as a result, their incomes are reliant upon their rents, and some of them have got mortgages which were buy-to-let mortgages, and that's leaving them with a great burden on their shoulders, and they're passing it on to the tenant. And I mean, I come across all the time young people who come out of university, they can't afford places to live. They're living, in the most extraordinary ways in order to survive in London, and I know that's true around the country. And so we're in a crisis where, I mean, young policemen can't afford it, young doctors can't, young lawyers, but young workers in any of these places, and they often have to move outside of town, and then they spend tons of money on transport to get to work, and spend hours, of course, doing it. And so it's no wonder that we have a society that's feeling deeply unhappy, and at the heart of it is one of the main issues is having a proper home, a place that you can call yours.
But is there a danger in the short term? I mean, you mentioned people who have taken out mortgages to rent out homes as their business. We've seen interest rates, of course, rising. We've got the renters reform bill coming in. Some of those people are saying it's now a hostile environment for landlords, and they are leaving. I mean, there are figures from the National Association of Property Buyers that say around 100,000 of these landlords will just quit the market. They'll just leave the business, and then the situation's worse, isn't it, Siobhan?
And would be made triply worse if there was rent controls brought in. I think state intervention into the rental market usually ends badly. But I think one of the reasons the Renters Reform Act is coming into Parliament shortly, it was a manifesto commitment. It was in that recognition that people are renting for longer periods. Individuals and families, we heard from Peter earlier, are renting for a long time. So what Michael Gove, the Secretary of State, is absolutely passionate about is improving standards for people who are renting, giving them the same opportunities like owning pets and things. So that's one side. But there is a balance to be struck whereby you increase standards, you protect the renters, you give tenants a really good living standard and life, but you don't spook the landlords or make it so expensive and prohibitive to own properties. And I think...
And isn't the central point what Tim was saying, though, is that there just aren't enough homes?
Well, I think building supply, I think we can all agree that there needs to be more homes built.
The Conservatives have failed in that regard.
I mean, I think we've built more homes than the Labour.
So it's one of my few hopes, actually, for a Labour government, actually, and I don't want a Labour government. But
you'll get a Labour government, Tim.
Although we just saw their stance on the neutrality.
That's true, but I think one of the reasons why the Conservatives haven't built houses in the parts of the country where they most need them is the NIMBY vote. Yeah. And the fact is that these are Conservative-held seats and the Conservatives are frightened of them. Labour will build in these areas, partly because they don't have the political downside that the Conservatives have about face. And not necessarily for the most pure of motives.
Have you got a new building in Stroud?
Oh, yes. I mean, we've got buildings in Stroud, but we've got a local plan, and a Labour Green council has just messed up the local plan. But anyway, I say, but what I would say, just to your point, Lizzie, on landlords, it is really important as we see this legislation come through that we do not demonise landlords. About 40% of landlords are single property owning. This is their life's work, often their pension. They really are good landlords in many respects, and we had evidence to the DWP Select Committee to a lot of what you were saying about that landlords are exiting the market. So I think there is a balance to be struck, but I think it's right to raise standards in the meantime.
All right. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave that there, and we're now going to look at some pictures of the Princess of Wales. Ooh, gasps in the studio there. Of course. The Princess of Wales inflating a life jacket. Lots of smiles, bit of a mishap. She seems to be absolutely as popular as ever, and you can see there are lots of pictures of this incident with a life jacket on all the papers. Let's have a look at the coverage on the Daily Telegraph there. You can see laughing away. Never seems to put a foot wrong, but does that, a year after the death of the Queen, translate to popularity with the monarchy? Well, someone who has written on this is Dr. Ed Owens. He has a new book out called After Elizabeth. Can the monarchy save itself? Can it, Ed?
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me on. Yes, the monarchy can save itself. But as I seek to emphasise in this new book, it hasn't undergone any great sense of modernisation, really, in the last 30 years. It's been free-floating in that respect. And now I think the king has an opportunity to really grip the steering wheel and transform this institution, bringing it up to date and into the 21st century.
Now, when you say grip the steering wheel, you're talking about quite dramatic steps. One of the things you suggest is that he would, resign.
Abdicate.
But not
He'd go, that's it.
Not before reinventing the institution. Yeah, you're absolutely right, because we have to think back to what abdication represented for the late Queen. It was anathema to her, partly because what happened in 1936 when her own father, George VI, took over Edward VIII following his abdication. So she was never going to abdicate. But when we look at European monarchies, what they tend to do is that, if you like, an aging monarch will hand over the reins to the next generation by abdicating at an appropriate time. Now, one of the things I emphasise in the book is that there's a great opportunity for King Charles to modernise this institution. We haven't seen it so far. The first year of his reign has been about stability, continuity, caution. I think there's a real opportunity here, and I think it's an opportunity that must be shared with William. I think this is a joint project that father and son have to lead, and that when the appropriate time comes, 10, 15 years from now, maybe even 20 years
what's
from
the most
the reins be handed on.
Ed, what's the most important thing they need to do?
Okay, there's lots of things that I suggest in the book, and I set out a concrete plan for change, how it would come about politically, but also with the emphasis on public support, a discussion in the media. I think this institution needs to be more democratic, more transparent, more accountable. One of the things that sort of crept into the reign of Elizabeth II was a lot of secrecy in terms of how the court engages with politicians, but also a lot of secrecy in terms of the family's archive. I think this institution needs demystifying. We think we know how it works, but we don't really. And I think in order to appeal to a younger generation who do care a lot more about accountability and transparency in public life, the king could set a really important example to other public figures, to politicians, by making this institution more transparent, by making it more accountable.
OK, all right. Thanks very much, Ed. Elena Kennedy, now you are a convert, I understand it, because you started life as a Republican, and then moved on to have an actual role in the coronation.
I did. It's very interesting because if you look at all the statistics, the young are the section of our communities that feel that why do we need royalty and why can't we have a president? And I was one of those people who, when I was in my 20s, felt that too.
But you grew out of it.
Well, let me tell you, if anybody cures you of the idea of presidency, you only have to look around the world, and certainly the United States hasn't inspired me thinking of Donald Trump. So I actually do think that as I became much more interested in how the Constitution works, I actually do think that there's a stability that's given by the continuum that there is by having a monarchy. But I agree with Ed, for example, about transparency and a much greater sense of how the whole thing works. And actually, I do think that there has to be a continued modernisation. But I do think that actually the King and Queen are pretty much on the button when it comes to this. I mean, the person that I was, who invited me to be part of her, group who were supporting her by carrying her regalia, was the Queen. I mean, I've known Queen Camilla for many years before she was ever even the Duchess of Cornwall, and I am engaged with her on lots of things to do with women and women's rights, and she's very interested in all of this. She's been very engaged with issues like domestic violence and speaking out about it. She has been hosts a thing on International Women's Day, and she's a real modern woman. And I think that she actually is a great asset to the royal family. It's about that, about more of that.
Ed is advocating abdication. So, I mean, has Queen Camilla been an asset to the royal family, Ed?
Oh, I would agree with Baroness Kennedy that in many respects she has engaged with issues in public life like domestic violence that were previously seen as taboo. And I think in that respect she's speaking out on topics that are of importance to the public. Is she an asset to the institution? Well, I think it's great that they were crowned together. I think, this was an improbable victory earlier this year with the coronation of a king and queen who you never would have imagined being crowned back in the 1990s together. So I think that works quite well, and it's the fulfillment, if you like, of a story of true love as well. That plays quite well with the public. But when we look at the opinion polls, we can see that Queen Camilla isn't particularly popular, especially with the younger generations. We started by talking about Catherine, Prince of Wales. She is far and above the most popular member of the British royal family, closely followed by Prince William. And then we get to King Charles and finally Queen Camilla. And Queen Camilla's poll ratings are much more divided, around about 50% positive, 50% negative. And that's simply because of, if you like, the hangover of the 1990s, the War of the Waleses back then, what happened very publicly.
The numbers are pretty stark when you look at the divide on ages. Richard, this is an interesting one for the SNP, isn't it? Because the party tends to hedge its bets. Do you think an independent Scotland would keep the monarchy?
Certainly the SNP's policy to maintain the monarchy, and I think there's an argument there about continuity in terms of the social union that people speak about, that you're ending the union of the parliaments, but you're not ending the union of the crowns under that version of independence, and I think that would be valuable for a lot of people. I mean, I would kind of class myself as a pretty unenthusiastic Republican for many of the reasons that Baroness Kennedy is.
You'll find yourself taking part in a coronation. Well, I mean, you don't know.
Well, let's hope not. I think my invitation is probably forever lost in the post. I've fouled my nest on that one. But it's simply about, what would you replace the institution with? But I think, to be honest, in terms of transparency and accountability, I take the arguments that are being made here, but I'm much more interested in the transparency and accountability, not of the ceremonial aspects of the Constitution, but the political side of the Constitution. And we've had a very, very recent example in Boris Johnson of what happens when you have a Prime Minister who is effectively out of control.
Yeah.
And I would far rather see energies being put into things like coming up with a written constitution, a Bill of Rights, codifying that and making it very, very clear what ministers can and cannot do, and having the Constitutional Court in place to keep ministers in check. I think that's a far more radical version of the reforms that we need. And I would love to look on from an independent Scotland and how the rest of the UK is getting on with that.
Well, I still miss Queen Elizabeth. It still hurts to think she's not there. But one of I think Ed's recommendation is very interesting. But what I really disagree with is the idea of thinning down the monarchy. And I think Princess Anne has made this point. Actually, we had Sophie visit Salisbury recently, and there is a role where the royal family need, in terms of opening hospitals, visiting charities, supporting charities, you need a critical number for them to be able to service the whole country. That's their roots in the communities is a big part of their support. And the Princess Anne has already made the point, a lot of them are getting older, and actually do need a certain number of working royals to actually perform those public functions.
And do you think young voters can be won over just finally?
What was wonderful was just to view the coronation through my young daughter's eyes, and they were learning about crowns and things like that, and thrones and the COVID. But I've got a long-standing girl crush on Camilla, the Princess of Wales, and increasingly so. Increasingly so on Queen Camilla, and that's because of their work on early years, on their work in fighting, and they passionately believe it, and they're using their platform for public good, but they will do long-term work that the political world doesn't often get an opportunity to do, and that's why I don't think the danger is there that Ed perhaps speaks to about the royal family.
OK, all right. Well, Dr Ed Owens, thank you very much for joining us. Well, I'm sure that your book is being passed round at the palace. They're all looking at it with interest, I'm sure. That is all we have time for today, but I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live. We're on at 12:15 because there's no PMQs tomorrow. Join us here on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.